The crack of splintering wood echoed through the Silver Moon saloon as Thomas Mackenzie's boot connected with the batwing doors, sending them flying wide enough to frame his silhouette against the harsh Arizona sun. Every conversation died mid-sentence, every glass froze halfway to waiting lips, and even the piano player's weathered fingers stuttered to a halt on the yellowed keys. The young man standing in the doorway wasn't particularly tall or broad, but something in the set of his shoulders and the way his right hand hung loose near his holstered Colt made every soul in that smoke-filled room understand that death had just walked through their door. Jake Sullivan didn't even look up from his poker hand, though the slight tightening around his pale eyes betrayed that he'd heard every boot fall across the dusty main street leading to this moment. The man they called Malfirme had been expecting this visit for 3 years, ever since word reached him that young Mackenzie had finally grown old enough to wear a gun and foolish enough to think he could use it. Sullivan's fingers, steady as desert stone, arranged his cards with deliberate calm while the saloon held its collective breath. Mackenzie's spurs jangled a funeral march as he crossed the sawdust-covered floor, his boots finding every creaking board in the old building. The afternoon light streaming through grimy windows caught the dust motes dancing between the two men like tiny spirits bearing witness to what everyone knew was about to unfold. Behind the bar, Pete Hernandez slowly reached for the shotgun he kept for situations exactly like this one, though his weathered hands trembled with the knowledge that whatever happened next would be over long before he could bring it to bear. "You killed my brother," Mackenzie said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man stating the color of the sky. No question, no accusation, just fact delivered like a bullet to the chest. His words cut through the tobacco smoke and whiskey fumes that perpetually clouded the Silver Moon's interior, each syllable precise and measured as a clockmaker's finest work. Sullivan finally raised his head, revealing eyes the color of winter ice that had looked upon more dying men than most folk see living ones. His face, weathered by decades under the desert sun and marked by a thin scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, showed no more emotion than carved granite. The famous gunslinger's reputation wasn't built on bluster or wild shooting, but on the cold calculation that allowed him to put 6 shots through a silver dollar at 50 paces while other men were still clearing leather. "Your brother drew first," Sullivan replied, setting his cards face down on the green felt table with the same care most men reserved for handling dynamite. "Fair fight, witnessed by half the territory. Boy couldn't have been more than 19, but he had sand in his craw and lead in his hand." The gunslinger's voice carried the easy drawl of a man who'd had this conversation before, with other brothers, other sons, other men seeking to balance scales that could never truly be balanced. The poker game's other participants had long since melted away from the table like snow before a blowtorch, taking their money and their lives to safer corners of the establishment. Even hardened miners and cattle drovers who'd faced down Apache war parties and stampeding longhorns knew better than to sit between two men discussing the price of blood. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring, broken only by the slow tick of the grandfather clock in the corner that had been counting down to this moment for years. Mackenzie's hand moved to rest on the worn wooden grip of his revolver, a gesture that sent a visible ripple of tension through the watching crowd. "He was 22, and you goaded him into that fight. Told him our daddy was a coward and our mama was a whore. Made sure he had no choice but to call you out." The young man's voice remained steady, but something dangerous flickered behind his dark eyes like lightning building in storm clouds. Sullivan chuckled, a sound like gravel sliding down a mountainside. "Boy's got more sense than his brother did, at least. Tommy Mackenzie came at me wild as a Mustang, gun half out of leather before he even cleared his holster. I gave him every chance to walk away, but pride's a bullet that kills more men than lead ever will." The gunslinger rose from his chair with fluid grace, his movements economical and precise as a watchmaker's gears. "Tomorrow at noon," Mackenzie said, backing toward the door while keeping his eyes locked on Sullivan's face. "Main Street, in front of the church. Time to see if you're as fast as they say you are, or if killing my brother was just the luck of facing a boy with more courage than skill." The challenge hung in the air like cordite smoke after a gunfight, and Sullivan's thin lips curved into something that might have been a smile on a man with more warmth in his bones. "I'll be there, boy. But you best spend tonight thinking about whether your pride's worth dying for. Your brother's grave's got room for company, and the undertaker's always looking for more business." Mackenzie touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that somehow managed to be both respectful and defiant. "See you at noon, Sullivan." Try not to drink too much tonight. Wouldn't want you to blame the whiskey when I put you down." With that, he turned and walked back through the batwing doors, leaving behind a saloon full of men who'd just witnessed the opening act of what promised to be Silver Creek's most talked-about gunfight since the town was founded. Sullivan watched the young man's departure through the window, noting the steady way Mackenzie walked, the confident set of his shoulders, the fact that his hand never strayed far from his weapon. This wasn't the hot-headed boy who'd charged him 3 years ago. This was a man who'd taken time to learn his trade, who'd practiced until practice became instinct, who'd come to Silver Creek not for revenge but for something much more dangerous: justice. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the dusty street outside, Sullivan found himself studying his own reflection in the grimy window glass. The face looking back at him had seen 43 years of desert sun and mountain snow, of boom towns and ghost towns, of men who thought they were fast enough to earn a reputation by killing Jake Sullivan. Most of those men were feeding desert flowers now, their names carved on wooden markers that the wind would eventually sandblast smooth. But something about young Mackenzie bothered him, some detail that didn't fit the pattern of all the other young guns who'd come calling over the years. The boy had been calm, too calm for someone about to face the most feared gunslinger between the Rio Grande and the Colorado River. There'd been no bluster, no threats beyond the simple challenge, no signs of the fear-driven bravado that usually marked men walking into their own funerals. Sullivan ordered another whiskey and settled back into his chair, but found himself unable to concentrate on the cards being dealt around him. Outside, Silver Creek's main street buzzed with activity as word of tomorrow's duel spread like wildfire through a dry forest. Men who'd been planning to ride out in the morning suddenly found urgent business that would keep them in town until afternoon. The local preacher was already composing a sermon about the wages of sin, while the undertaker was quietly taking measurements and making calculations. As the sun set behind the distant mountains, painting the sky the color of fresh blood, Sullivan found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, wondering if tomorrow might be the day his luck finally ran out. The sensation was unfamiliar and unwelcome, like finding a rattlesnake coiled in his bedroll. Jake Sullivan had built his reputation on the absolute certainty that he was faster, smarter, and more ruthless than any man fool enough to face him in the street. But young Mackenzie had looked at him with eyes that held no fear, no doubt, no recognition of Sullivan's deadly reputation. The gunslinger finished his drink and made his way up the narrow stairs to his room above the saloon, each step echoing in the suddenly quiet building like the countdown to midnight. Behind him, the poker game resumed with subdued voices and nervous glances toward the window, while outside the desert wind began to howl through the streets like a banshee warning of death to come. In his room, Sullivan methodically cleaned and checked his twin Colt peacemakers, weapons that had never failed him in 25 years of professional killing. The familiar ritual of oil and steel usually calmed his mind, but tonight his thoughts kept returning to the strange confidence he'd seen in Mackenzie's face. The young man had looked at him like he was already dead, like the duel tomorrow was just a formality to confirm what had already been decided by some higher power. As midnight approached, Sullivan found himself standing at his window, looking down at the empty street where tomorrow's drama would unfold. The moon hung full and bright above Silver Creek, casting everything in stark silver light that turned shadows into pools of absolute darkness. Somewhere out there, young Mackenzie was probably doing the same thing, checking his weapon, saying his prayers, making peace with whatever God watched over men who settled their differences with lead and gunpowder. What Sullivan couldn't know, what would have changed everything if he'd possessed even the smallest grain of such knowledge, was that at that very moment Thomas Mackenzie was not praying or cleaning his gun or making peace with mortality. Instead, the young man was carefully removing every cartridge from his gun belt and examining each one with the practiced eye of someone who understood the precise relationship between powder charges, bullet weight, and the delicate machinery of death. Mackenzie's fingers worked with steady precision as he made subtle modifications that would have puzzled most men and terrified any who understood their implications. The clock in Sullivan's room chimed midnight, marking the beginning of what would be either his greatest victory or his final day on Earth. But as the gunslinger finally settled into an uneasy sleep, he remained blissfully unaware that his opponent was already 3 steps ahead in a game far more complex and deadly than any simple showdown in the street. Dawn broke over Silver Creek like a wounded animal bleeding light across the desert sky, painting the dusty main street in shades of amber and copper that seemed to prophesy the violence to come. Thomas Mackenzie had been awake for hours, sitting motionless on the edge of his bed in the boarding house, watching the shadows retreat from the corners of his small room as if they too were afraid of what the day would bring. His hands, steady as mountain stone, held a single brass cartridge up to the pale morning light streaming through his window, examining it with the focused intensity of a man whose life depended on understanding every grain of powder, every fraction of an ounce of lead. The cartridge looked perfectly ordinary to any casual observer, its brass case gleaming dully in the dawn light, the lead bullet seated properly in the mouth of the shell. But Mackenzie knew something about this ammunition that would have sent ice through the veins of any man who understood the deadly mathematics of ballistics and the precise science of controlled explosions. He'd spent the better part of the night making calculations that his brother had taught him during their years working the copper mines outside Tucson, applying principles of engineering and chemistry that most gunfighters never bothered to learn. Across town, Jake Sullivan was engaged in preparations of his own, though his were of a considerably more traditional nature. The famous Gunslinger stood before the cracked mirror in his room above the Silver Moon Saloon, methodically checking his appearance with the same attention to detail he applied to his weapons. His black coat was brushed clean of dust, his string tie knotted precisely, his hat positioned at the exact angle that had become his trademark in a dozen towns across the territory. Everything about Sullivan's appearance was calculated to project the image of a man completely in control, a professional killer who approached his work with the same dispassionate efficiency other men brought to carpentry or farming. But beneath that carefully maintained exterior, Sullivan's mind was working through possibilities and contingencies with the cold logic that had kept him alive through 25 years of professional violence. Young Mackenzie bothered him in ways he couldn't quite articulate, some instinct honed by decades of reading men's souls in their eyes warning him that this duel was different from all the others. The boy had shown none of the telltale signs of fear or false bravado that marked most challengers, none of the desperate fury or righteous anger that usually drove men to face impossible odds in pursuit of revenge or justice. As the sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across Silver Creek's main thoroughfare, the town began to buzz with the kind of anticipatory energy that preceded public hangings and prize fights. Men who normally would have been at their claims or tending their herds found urgent reasons to linger near the church, where wooden crates and barrels were being arranged into makeshift grandstands for the dozens of spectators who'd gathered to witness what many believed would be Thomas Mackenzie's execution. The local saloon keepers had opened their doors early, knowing that men facing the possibility of violent death often developed powerful thirsts that needed slaking. Dr. Marcus Webb, Silver Creek's only physician, was already setting up his medical supplies in the barbershop that doubled as the town's surgery, laying out bone saws and laudanum bottles with the grim efficiency of a man who treated too many gunshot wounds to harbor any illusions about the afternoon's likely outcome. The preacher, Reverend Samuel Hayes, wandered among the growing crowd offering final prayers to any man who felt the need to make peace with his maker before witnessing what everyone assumed would be young Mackenzie's swift dispatch to whatever judgment awaited him beyond the grave. But it was the presence of certain other figures in the crowd that would have interested Mackenzie most, had he been aware of their careful positioning around the makeshift arena. 3 men wearing the distinctive badges of territorial marshals had ridden into Silver Creek just after sunrise, their horses lathered from hard travel and their faces bearing the grim expressions of lawmen who'd received urgent telegrams in the middle of the night. Marshal Henry Dalton, the senior among them, kept checking his pocket watch with the nervous precision of a man operating on a very specific timetable. At 11:30, Sullivan made his traditional pre-duel pilgrimage to the church, where he always spent exactly 15 minutes in what most observers assumed was prayer or meditation. But anyone watching closely would have noticed that the gunslinger's attention was focused not on the altar or the crude wooden cross that dominated the small sanctuary, but on the boarding house directly across the street where his opponent was presumably making his own final preparations. What Sullivan was actually doing during those 15 minutes was something he'd learned from an old Apache tracker years earlier, letting his eyes adjust to the bright sunlight that would soon be his primary battlefield, while simultaneously studying every angle, every shadow, every potential advantage the street might offer. But this morning, Sullivan's traditional routine included one additional element that none of the gathering spectators could have suspected. As he knelt in the front pew, ostensibly deep in prayer, the gunslinger's practiced fingers were working at the simple lock on the church's back door, a skill he'd acquired during his younger days when his methods of acquiring money had been considerably less legal than challenging men to duels. The lock gave way with barely a whisper of sound, and Sullivan slipped through the door into the narrow alley that ran behind the main street's buildings. Moving with the silent grace that had made him legendary among the Apache and Comanche who'd learned to fear the sound of his name, Sullivan made his way to the back of the boarding house where Mackenzie had spent the night. The building's rear entrance was secured with nothing more substantial than a simple wooden latch, and within moments the gunslinger was climbing the narrow stairs that led to the second-floor rooms. His boots made no sound on the worn wooden steps, and his breathing remained as steady and controlled as if he were sitting in his own parlor reading a newspaper. Mackenzie's room was easy to identify, marked by the faint scent of gun oil and the particular quality of silence that surrounded men preparing for death. Sullivan's lockpicking skills made short work of the door, and within seconds he was inside the small chamber where his opponent had spent the night. The room was neat as a military barracks, with Mackenzie's few possessions arranged with almost obsessive precision on the single wooden table that served as both desk and dresser. Sullivan's eyes immediately found what he was looking for: Mackenzie's gun belt, hanging from a peg near the window where the morning light could reveal any flaws or imperfections in the leather or metal. The gunslinger approached the weapon with the same careful respect a snake handler might show a particularly venomous specimen, knowing that even an unloaded revolver could be dangerous in the right hands. But when he examined the cartridge loops that circled the belt, Sullivan's pale eyes narrowed with something approaching confusion. The ammunition was there, 6 brass cartridges nestled in their leather loops with military precision, but something about them struck Sullivan as wrong in ways he couldn't immediately articulate. The cartridges looked perfectly normal, their brass cases showing the proper amount of tarnish and where that indicated regular handling, their lead bullets seated at exactly the right depth in the shell mouths. But there was something about their weight, their balance, that felt subtly different from the thousands of rounds Sullivan had handled over the course of his violent career. Working quickly but carefully, Sullivan removed each cartridge from the belt and examined it with the practiced eye of a man whose life had always depended on understanding the precise relationship between powder, lead, and destiny. What he found confirmed his initial suspicions while raising entirely new questions that he had neither time nor inclination to pursue. The cartridges had definitely been tampered with, their original loads removed and replaced with something that felt lighter, less substantial than standard gunpowder charges. Sullivan's thin lips curved into something that might have been a smile as he realized what Mackenzie had done. The boy had loaded his ammunition with reduced charges, probably hoping to improve his accuracy by minimizing recoil, a common mistake among inexperienced shooters who didn't understand that consistency was more important than comfort when it came to hitting what you aimed at. It was exactly the kind of error Sullivan would have expected from someone whose gun skills had been learned from books rather than bitter experience. Working with practiced efficiency, Sullivan removed each of Mackenzie's cartridges and replaced them with identical rounds he prepared for exactly this purpose, brass cases that looked perfectly normal but contained no powder at all, just enough wadding to hold the bullets in place and create the illusion of functional ammunition. It was a trick he'd used before, though never against an opponent who'd shown Mackenzie's peculiar combination of confidence and apparent inexperience. Most men facing Jake Sullivan were too nervous or too proud to resort to ammunition modifications, but Mackenzie had clearly been planning this confrontation for months or even years. As Sullivan completed his work and prepared to leave Mackenzie's room the same way he'd entered, the sound of boots on the stairs outside made him freeze like a deer scenting wolves. The footsteps were measured and steady, neither hurried nor hesitant, and they were definitely approaching the second floor. Sullivan's hand moved instinctively toward his holstered Colt before he remembered that he was supposedly a man of honor who would never stoop to shooting an opponent before their agreed-upon duel. The footsteps stopped directly outside Mackenzie's door, and Sullivan could hear the soft scrape of a key being inserted into the lock. For a moment that stretched like an eternity, the gunslinger considered his options: hide behind the door and overpower Mackenzie when he entered, claim he'd come to negotiate a peaceful settlement, or simply brazen out the situation with some story about checking on his opponent's readiness. But before he could decide on any particular course of action, the door swung open to reveal not Thomas Mackenzie but rather a grizzled man in his 60s whose marshal's badge caught the morning sunlight streaming through the window. Marshal Henry Dalton stepped into the room with his hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver, though his weathered face showed no particular surprise at finding Jake Sullivan standing beside Mackenzie's gun belt. The two men regarded each other for a long moment, like chess players studying a particularly complex position, before Dalton spoke in a voice that carried the authority of 30 years enforcing territorial law in places where such enforcement was often a matter of survival rather than justice. "Wondered if you'd try something like this," Dalton said, his tone conversational despite the tension crackling between them like electricity before a thunderstorm. "Tom figured you might, which is why he asked me to keep an eye on things. Boy's got more sense than his brother ever did, and considerably more patience when it comes to planning." Sullivan's mind raced through possibilities and implications, trying to understand how Mackenzie could have anticipated his actions while simultaneously calculating his chances of talking his way out of a situation that seemed to be sliding rapidly beyond his control. "Marshall," he said, injecting just the right note of injured dignity into his voice, "I hope you're not suggesting that Jake Sullivan would stoop to cheating in an affair of honor. I came here to check on young Mackenzie's welfare, make sure he understood what he was getting himself into." Dalton's chuckle was dry as desert sand and about as warm. "Save it for someone who wasn't there when you killed Billy Mackenzie 3 years ago. Tom's been planning this day ever since he got word of his brother's death, and he's thought through every angle, including the possibility that you might try to improve your odds by tampering with his ammunition." The marshal gestured toward the gun belt hanging from its peg. "Go ahead and check those cartridges, Sullivan. I think you'll find them very interesting." With growing unease, Sullivan examined one of the cartridges he thought he'd successfully replaced with his own doctored rounds. What he found made his blood run cold in ways that 25 years of violent death had never managed to accomplish. The cartridge case was identical to the one he'd removed, down to the smallest scratches and imperfections, but when he hefted it in his palm the weight was completely wrong. Instead of the empty shell he'd expected, this round felt heavier than any normal ammunition, as if it had been loaded with something considerably more substantial than standard gunpowder. "Tom spent 3 years working in the mines after his brother died," Dalton explained, watching Sullivan's face with the satisfied expression of a man revealing the final card in a winning hand. "Learned all kinds of interesting things about explosives and metallurgy, chemistry and engineering. Amazing what a man can accomplish when he puts his mind to it and has the right motivation." Sullivan's hands trembled almost imperceptibly as he examined the cartridge more closely, using his thumbnail to scratch at what he'd assumed was a normal lead bullet. Instead of soft metal, his nail encountered something considerably harder, something that gleamed with a faint copper sheen that spoke of careful metallurgical work. The bullet wasn't lead at all, but rather some kind of hardened alloy that had been crafted to precise specifications by someone who understood the relationship between projectile composition and terminal ballistics. "The powder charge is his own mixture too," Dalton continued, clearly enjoying Sullivan's growing realization of just how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered. "Something he developed based on what they use in the mines for precision blasting. Burns hotter and faster than anything you've ever seen, generates pressures that would probably split a normal revolver barrel like a ripe melon. But Tom had his gun modified by a machinist in Tucson, reinforced and rebalanced to handle loads that would kill most men just from the recoil." The church bell began to toll noon, its bronze voice carrying across Silver Creek with the finality of a funeral dirge. Sullivan looked out the window to see the main street filling with spectators, men and women who'd come to witness what they expected would be a routine execution disguised as an affair of honor. But instead of the familiar pre-duel confidence that had sustained him through dozens of similar situations, Sullivan found himself facing something entirely new, the cold certainty that he'd been comprehensively outthought by an opponent he'd dismissed as just another grieving relative seeking impossible justice. "Time to go," Dalton said, stepping aside to let Sullivan pass. "Tom's waiting for you in the street, and I expect he's eager to show you what 3 years of careful planning can accomplish. Should be educational for everyone involved." Sullivan walked toward his appointment with destiny on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, his mind struggling to process the implications of what he'd learned. Mackenzie hadn't just prepared for this duel, he'd engineered it with the same precision most men applied to building houses or designing machinery. Every detail had been anticipated, every contingency planned for, every possible advantage calculated and countered with scientific precision. The crowd parted before Sullivan like water before the prow of a ship, their faces showing the mixture of excitement and dread that always accompanied public violence. But today there was something different in their expressions, a tension that suggested some of them at least suspected they were about to witness something unprecedented in the annals of frontier justice. Word of the marshal's presence had spread through the gathering, and men who'd come expecting a simple execution were beginning to sense that they might instead be observing the downfall of a legend. Thomas Mackenzie stood in the exact center of the main street, positioned with mathematical precision 50 feet from where Sullivan would take his place. The young man's appearance was as neat and controlled as it had been the previous afternoon, but now Sullivan could see details he'd missed before. The way Mackenzie's holster had been modified with additional leather reinforcement around the cylinder area, the subtle bulge in his vest pocket that probably contained additional ammunition, the almost imperceptible confidence that came from a man who knew exactly what was going to happen and when. As Sullivan took his position, he found himself looking into Mackenzie's eyes and seeing something that chilled him more than any threat or insult ever could: pity. The young man was looking at him not with the hatred or fury Sullivan had expected, but with the calm regret of someone forced to put down a dangerous animal. It was the expression of a man who'd already grieved for his enemy's death, who'd made peace with the necessity of killing and moved beyond it to focus on the technical requirements of the task at hand. The referee, chosen by mutual agreement from among Silver Creek's most respected citizens, began the traditional countdown that would end with both men drawing their weapons and settling their differences with lead and fire. But as the numbers fell away like leaves in autumn, Sullivan found himself thinking not about speed or accuracy or any of the skills that had kept him alive for a quarter century, but about the strange weight of those modified cartridges and the careful planning that had anticipated even his most desperate attempts at gaining an advantage. 10, called the referee, his voice carrying clearly across the sudden silence that had fallen over the crowd like a burial shroud. Sullivan's hand hovered near his holster, muscle memory taking over from conscious thought as his body prepared to execute the same deadly sequence that had ended dozens of lives across the territory. 5, the referee continued, and Sullivan could see Mackenzie settling into a stance that spoke of countless hours of practice and preparation. 3, 2, 1, draw. Both men's hands moved toward their weapons with fluid precision, but what happened next would be talked about in Silver Creek saloons for generations to come. Sullivan's draw was everything his reputation promised: smooth, fast, and deadly accurate as his Colt cleared leather and lined up on Mackenzie's center mass with mechanical perfection. The gunslinger's finger tightened on the trigger with the confidence born of absolute expertise and complete faith in his weapon's reliability. The click of the firing pin striking an empty chamber was as loud as thunder in the desert silence. Mackenzie's gun spoke once, a sound like the world cracking open, and Jake Sullivan was flung backward as if struck by a sledgehammer wielded by giants. The famous gunslinger hit the dusty street with an impact that raised a cloud of fine particles that caught the noon sunlight like gold dust, but he was beyond caring about such trivial concerns. Thomas Mackenzie's carefully engineered bullet had found its mark with devastating precision, carrying with it 3 years of patient planning and the focused fury of perfect justice finally achieved. As the smoke cleared and the echoes of that single shot faded into the desert silence, the crowd began to understand that they'd witnessed something far more complex than a simple duel. This had been an execution planned with scientific precision, carried out by a man who'd spent years learning exactly what combination of chemistry, metallurgy, and ballistics would be required to bring down the most feared gunslinger in the territory. Marshal Dalton stepped forward to examine Sullivan's body, confirming what everyone already knew while Mackenzie methodically reloaded his weapon with the calm efficiency of a man completing a long-planned task. The crowd began to disperse slowly, their voices hushed as they discussed what they'd witnessed and tried to understand how Jake Sullivan's legendary speed and skill had proven utterly useless against an opponent who'd fought the duel not with reflexes and instinct, but with engineering and chemistry. As the desert sun climbed toward its zenith, casting short shadows across Silver Creek's main street, Thomas Mackenzie holstered his weapon and walked away from the scene of his carefully orchestrated triumph. Behind him lay the body of the man who'd killed his brother, while ahead stretched a future where justice had finally been balanced not through wild gunplay or desperate fury, but through the patient application of knowledge, planning, and the precise understanding that sometimes the most devastating weapon isn't speed or skill, but simply knowing exactly what your enemy will do and being prepared for it when he does. The tale of how the gunslinger stole the cowboy's bullets before the duel, but never thought he used gunpowder, would become legend throughout the territory, a story that proved once and for all that in the deadly mathematics of frontier justice, the smartest man doesn't always draw first, but he invariably draws last. The desert wind that swept through Silver Creek in the hours following Jake Sullivan's death carried with it more than just dust and tumbleweeds. It carried whispers, rumors, and the kind of hushed speculation that follows events so extraordinary they challenge everything men thought they knew about the nature of justice and the price of revenge. By sunset, word of the duel had spread to every ranch, mining claim, and trading post within 50 miles, carried by riders whose horses had barely stopped lathering before their masters were recounting the impossible tale of how the territory's most feared gunslinger had been brought down by superior engineering rather than superior speed. Thomas Mackenzie had disappeared from Silver Creek within an hour of Sullivan's death, vanishing as thoroughly as smoke in a windstorm while the crowd was still debating the finer points of what they'd witnessed. Some claimed they'd seen him riding north toward the Colorado Territory, while others swore he'd headed south into Mexico, but Marshal Henry Dalton knew better. The young man hadn't fled at all, he'd simply melted back into the desert landscape with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years learning to become invisible when necessity demanded it. 3 days after the duel, Dalton received a telegram that confirmed what he'd suspected from the moment Mackenzie had first contacted him about Sullivan's inevitable attempt to cheat. The message, sent from the territorial capital, contained information that would have shocked even the most hardened observers of frontier justice had they been privy to its contents. Thomas Mackenzie was no simple mining engineer seeking vengeance for his brother's death. He was, in fact, a specially commissioned agent of the territorial government, tasked with bringing Jake Sullivan to justice for crimes that went far beyond the single killing that had precipitated their confrontation. The truth about Jake Sullivan, the man they'd called Mau Firme, was considerably more complex than his reputation suggested. Over the course of 15 years, the famous gunslinger had accumulated a record of criminal activity that read like a catalogue of frontier lawlessness: stage robberies disguised as affairs of honor, claim jumping backed by manufactured disputes, and at least a dozen murders that had been carefully arranged to look like fair fights. Sullivan's method was always the same, a pattern so consistent that territorial investigators had finally been able to predict his movements with mathematical precision. The gunslinger would arrive in a prosperous mining town or cattle center, identify the wealthiest or most influential local residents, and then systematically provoke them into duels through a combination of calculated insults and manufactured grievances. His reputation for honesty in such matters was itself a carefully constructed lie, maintained through bribes, intimidation, and the selective elimination of witnesses who might have contradicted the official version of events. By the time Sullivan left town, he was invariably several $1,000s richer and the community was invariably poorer by one or more of its leading citizens. Billy Mackenzie's death had been part of this pattern, though Sullivan had made a crucial error in targeting the wrong member of the Mackenzie family. The young man had indeed drawn first, but only after Sullivan had spent 3 days systematically destroying his reputation, questioning his courage, and making increasingly personal attacks on his family's honor. What Sullivan hadn't known was that Billy Mackenzie was the younger brother of a man whose intellect and patience far exceeded his own capacity for simple violence. Thomas Mackenzie had spent those 3 years since his brother's death not just learning mining engineering, but working as an undercover investigator for the territorial government. His assignment had been to gather evidence of Sullivan's criminal activities while simultaneously preparing for the confrontation that everyone knew was inevitable. The modified ammunition, the reinforced revolver, the careful choreography of the duel itself, all of it had been planned not just as an act of personal vengeance, but as the culmination of a complex law enforcement operation designed to end Sullivan's reign of terror once and for all. But even Marshal Dalton, with his 30 years of frontier law enforcement experience, couldn't have anticipated the full scope of what Mackenzie had discovered during his investigation. Hidden in Sullivan's room above the Silver Moon Saloon, investigators found detailed records of every criminal enterprise the gunslinger had undertaken, written in his own hand and apparently intended as some form of insurance against former associates who might consider betraying him. The documents revealed a network of corruption that extended far beyond simple highway robbery, encompassing bribery of territorial officials, manipulation of mining claims, and systematic intimidation of witnesses and lawmen who might have interfered with Sullivan's operations. Among the most damning evidence was correspondence between Sullivan and certain members of the territorial legislature, men who'd been receiving regular payments in exchange for ensuring that investigations into the gunslinger's activities were consistently misdirected or abandoned. The scandal that erupted when these documents became public led to resignations, indictments, and a complete reorganization of territorial law enforcement that would have ramifications for decades to come. But perhaps the most shocking revelation contained in Sullivan's papers was the true reason behind Billy Mackenzie's death. The young man hadn't been killed because he was fast with a gun or because he'd challenged Sullivan's reputation. He'd been murdered because he'd accidentally discovered evidence of Sullivan's involvement in a massive silver theft from the Comstock mines, evidence that would have sent the gunslinger to federal prison for the rest of his natural life. Billy Mackenzie's supposed challenge to a duel had actually been an attempt to present this evidence publicly, but Sullivan had manipulated the situation to make it appear that the young man was seeking a fight over some trivial insult. Thomas Mackenzie had learned all of this through months of painstaking investigation, interviewing witnesses who'd been too frightened to speak while Sullivan was alive, examining financial records that revealed patterns of unexplained wealth, and slowly piecing together a criminal conspiracy that had operated with impunity for more than a decade. His decision to challenge Sullivan to a duel hadn't been motivated solely by personal revenge, but by the knowledge that traditional legal processes had failed completely to bring the gunslinger to justice. The engineering skills that had made Mackenzie's victory possible were themselves the product of careful planning that went far beyond simple ballistics and metallurgy. During his time in the mines, he'd studied not just explosives and chemistry, but psychology and human behavior, learning to predict how men like Sullivan would react under pressure and how their own arrogance could be turned against them. The trap he'd set for the gunslinger had been years in the making, a complex mechanism designed to exploit every weakness in Sullivan's character while simultaneously gathering the evidence needed to expose the full scope of his criminal activities. As autumn settled over Silver Creek and the desert began its slow transition toward winter, the town found itself fundamentally changed by the events of that noon hour in late September. The Silver Moon Saloon, once the center of the community's social and commercial life, stood empty and boarded up, its owner having fled when investigators discovered his role in laundering Sullivan's stolen money. The church where Sullivan had made his final preparations became a place of genuine pilgrimage for those seeking to understand how justice could emerge from such an unlikely combination of patience, intelligence, and carefully applied violence. Marshal Dalton remained in Silver Creek for several weeks, overseeing the investigation that followed Sullivan's death and helping to untangle the complex web of corruption the gunslinger had woven throughout the territory. But even he never learned the full truth about Thomas Mackenzie's ultimate fate, though he suspected the young man had been reassigned to other cases, other territories where similar problems required similar solutions. The territorial government, embarrassed by the revelations of corruption within its own ranks, was eager to minimize publicity about the methods used to bring Sullivan to justice. Years later, stories would emerge from various frontier communities about mysterious strangers who appeared whenever local strongmen became too comfortable with their own invincibility. These strangers invariably possessed uncommon intelligence, unusual technical skills, and a patience that bordered on the supernatural. They would study their targets with scientific precision, learning their habits and weaknesses before striking with devastating effectiveness. Some claimed these were all different men, while others insisted they were encountering the same individual operating under different identities. The legend of Thomas Mackenzie grew in the telling, as frontier legends inevitably do, until it became difficult to separate fact from fiction in the various accounts of his exploits. But one element remained constant in every version of the story: the image of a man who understood that in a world where violence was often the only available solution to injustice, the most effective violence was that which was planned, prepared for, and executed with scientific precision rather than wild emotion. The grave marker that eventually appeared over Jake Sullivan's burial site bore only his name and the dates of his birth and death, but everyone in Silver Creek knew that the simple stone represented more than just the end of one man's life. It marked the conclusion of an era when reputation alone could shield a killer from the consequences of his actions, when fear could substitute for law, and when the fastest gun was automatically assumed to be in the right. As the years passed and Silver Creek evolved from a rough mining camp into a proper town with churches and schools and elected officials, the story of the duel became part of local folklore, told and retold around campfires and in saloons throughout the territory. But those who'd been present on that September afternoon never forgot the most important lesson of what they'd witnessed: that in the eternal struggle between justice and violence, intelligence would always triumph over mere speed, preparation would always defeat improvisation, and the man who thought furthest ahead would invariably be the one left standing when the smoke finally cleared. The desert wind still blows through Silver Creek, carrying dust and memories across the landscape where legends were born and died in the span of heartbeats. But now it carries something else as well: the understanding that justice, like any complex engineering project, requires patience, precision, and the absolute certainty that when the moment comes to act, every detail has been anticipated, every variable accounted for, and every possible outcome prepared for with scientific thoroughness. In the end, that may be the most lasting legacy of the day when Thomas Mackenzie proved that sometimes the most devastating weapon isn't the fastest draw, but simply knowing exactly what your enemy will do and being ready for it when he does.